There is a man who once sold his dead father's clothes just to buy food. He was 15 years old, no education, no family money, no connections. Just a boy in a factory working 16-hour days for $2 a week. Nobody looked at him and saw anything at all. But that boy built one of the largest business empires Asia has ever seen. Over 50 countries, 300,000 employees, $57 billion in revenue, ports, telecom networks, over 16,000 retail stores. By 2026, his fortune reached $45.1 billion. The richest man in one of the wealthiest cities on earth. He never finished school. Born in the late 1920s in southern China, he fled war as a 12-year-old refugee carrying nothing. Within 3 years, his father was dead. While other children went to school, he worked with chemicals and heat. But in the margins of his exhaustion, he started learning in product catalogs, in supply and demand, watching a colonial trading post transform into the financial capital of Asia. The world would call him Superman. This is the full story of how a penniless refugee owned the city. It begins in 1940 with a boy in a harbor he had never seen. In 1940, a 12-year-old boy arrived in a city he had never seen. He came from Haozhou in southern China, fleeing the Japanese invasion with his family. They carried nothing, no savings, no contacts, no plan beyond survival. The city they landed in was not the gleaming financial center it would later become. It was a British colonial outpost, crowded with thousands of refugees just like them. The boy's father was a school teacher, a man of education but not of money. Think about the hardest move you have ever made. Now strip away everything that made it manageable. No safety net, no plan, just war, poverty, and a family depending on you. That was this boy's starting line. But within 3 years, even that fragile stability shattered. In 1943, his father died of tuberculosis. The boy was 15. His education was over, his childhood was over, and the weight of feeding his entire family fell on his shoulders. His father had believed that knowledge was the only path out of poverty. The boy would carry that belief for the rest of his life, even though he would never sit in a classroom again. Decades later, he would pour billions into universities and education, honoring the father whose death took away his chance to learn. But that was far in the future. Right now, he was 15, alone, and desperate. He took the only job he could find, a plastics factory, 16-hour days, $2 a week. And inside that factory, something started happening that nobody noticed. The boy was not just working, he was learning. His name was Li Ka-shing, and from 1943 to 1950, he worked in a plastics factory in Hong Kong, making plastic watch bands and belts for $2 a week. 16-hour shifts, chemicals, heat, exhaustion. Most workers saw nothing beyond the next paycheck. Li saw something else. During his rare free moments, he studied product catalogs. He memorized manufacturing processes. He taught himself about plastics technology, business principles, and supply and demand. No teacher, no textbook, no classroom, just observation and determination. This is the period that made Li Ka-shing, not the billion-dollar deals, the factory, where a teenager with nothing decided that poverty was not going to be permanent. He could not afford school, so he made the factory his school. By age 17, his work ethic impressed the owner enough to promote him to salesman. By age 19, he was general manager, running the entire operation that had hired him as a child laborer just 4 years earlier. He saved every dollar he could. But here is what most people miss. Li did not just learn about plastics. He learned about people, how to sell, how to manage, how to read what a market wants before it knows. The factory did not just teach him to make things, it taught him to think. Years later, Li said his inability to attend school was the most painful experience of his youth. But being forced to educate himself gave him a different kind of intelligence. Practical, pattern recognition, learning by doing. It became the foundation of everything that followed. By 1950, Li was 22 years old. He took his savings, borrowed what he could, and made the decision that changed his life. He started his own company. He named it after the longest river in China, a river that begins as a trickle and grows into one of the most powerful forces on earth. He called the company Cheung Kong. In 1950, a 22-year-old with almost nothing started his own company. He named it Cheung Kong, after the Yangtze River in Cantonese. The name was not random. The Yangtze does not start as a mighty force. It begins as a small stream high in the mountains of Tibet, barely visible, easily overlooked. But it grows mile by mile until it becomes one of the most powerful rivers on Earth. Li saw himself in that river, small at the start, destined to become unstoppable. The company began with basic plastic goods, but Li was hunting for something bigger, a product with global demand that Hong Kong could produce cheaply and export at scale. In the mid-1950s, he traveled to Italy. He visited a factory making plastic flowers using techniques no one in Asia had seen. Everyone else saw decorations. Li saw a global business waiting to be built. He brought the knowledge back to Hong Kong. Chung Kong became the first company to mass-produce plastic flowers for export to Europe and North America. By 1958, Li was Hong Kong's largest producer of plastic flowers. They called him the Plastic Flower King. His first fortune was made, but the money was not the point. What mattered was what he did next. Because by 1958, Li had already spotted something far bigger on the horizon. He had been watching Hong Kong's skyline change. He had been studying the property market, and he noticed something most people were too afraid to act on. In a city with limited land and unlimited demand, the person who owns the ground beneath the buildings owns everything. The Plastic Flower King was about to disappear, and a real estate titan was about to be born. In 1958, Li Ka-shing made a decision that would define the next 60 years of his life. He walked away from plastics and entered real estate. He was 30 years old, running the biggest plastic flower operation in Hong Kong. He could have stayed in manufacturing forever, but Li saw where Hong Kong's future was flowing: real estate. The city had limited land, a rapidly growing population, and an economy transforming into Asia's premier financial center. Land was not just valuable, it was finite. Whoever controlled it would control the city's future. Li started buying properties during crashes. When everyone else panicked, Li purchased. His biggest move came after the 1967 Hong Kong riots. Property prices collapsed, residents fled, but Li bought aggressively, acquiring prime land at a fraction of its value. When stability returned, those investments multiplied many times over. The riots did not scare him, they made him rich. And the lesson became his philosophy: the best time to buy is when everyone else is too afraid to. By the late 1970s, Li was one of Hong Kong's most powerful developers, but he was still a local player. The city's economy was controlled by the British colonial establishment. No Chinese businessman had ever broken into their ranks. Then Li did something that shocked the entire city. In 1979, Li Ka-shing did something no Chinese person had ever done. He bought Hutchison Whampoa, one of Hong Kong's oldest and most prestigious British colonial trading houses. The Hongs had dominated Hong Kong since 1842. Shipping, ports, trading, infrastructure. For over a century, the British built them. The Chinese served in them. No one of Chinese ethnicity had ever owned one. Until Li. Think about the weight of this moment. A refugee who arrived with nothing, who sold his dead father's clothes for food, who worked 16-hour shifts making plastic watch bands, now owned a colonial empire built by the very power that once looked down on people like him. This was not just a business deal, it was a transfer of power, a statement that the old colonial order was ending. But Li did not buy Hutchison to preserve it as a museum piece. He bought it for what it gave him access to: global trading networks, port operations, international relationships built over 130 years. He did not just buy a company, he bought a platform for worldwide expansion. And over the next 4 decades, he would transform it into something the British founders never imagined. After acquiring Hutchison, Li did not slow down. He transformed it from a Hong Kong trading house into a global conglomerate operating across 52 countries. He expanded into ports and logistics, including Felixstowe in the UK, Europe's busiest container port. He built telecommunications networks under the 3 Group brand across Europe and Asia. He grew the A.S. Watson retail chain into over 16,000 stores worldwide. Superdrug, Crudevat, Watson's Pharmacy, Fortress Electronics. Think about the scale. A man who made plastic watch bands for $2 a week now operated ports handling millions of containers. Telecom networks connecting millions of people. Retail stores serving customers across dozens of countries. By 2015, Li merged Chung Kong and Hutchison into CK Hutchison Holdings. $57.3 billion in annual revenue. over 300,000 employees in more than 50 countries. But this expansion was not random. It was deliberate. Li was reducing his dependence on Hong Kong, a city whose political future grew uncertain as the 1997 handover to China approached. By building in Europe, North America, and other stable markets, Li ensured that no single political event could threaten his entire empire. The global expansion was not just growth, it was insurance. At his peak, it was said you could not get through a day in Hong Kong without touching one of Li's companies. Shopping at Watson's, using a 3-group phone, living in a Chung Kong apartment. The penniless refugee had become woven into the fabric of the city itself. But even as his empire grew, Li was making another decision, one that would define his legacy beyond wealth. In 1980, Li Ka-shing made a decision that had nothing to do with profit. He established the Li Ka-shing Foundation, and he called it his third son, alongside his biological sons, Victor and Richard. Over the next 4 decades, the foundation donated more than $2.5 billion to education, healthcare, disaster relief. This was not token generosity, it was transformative. A 1 billion Hong Kong dollar gift to the University of Hong Kong in 2005. The medical faculty was renamed the Li Ka-shing Faculty of Medicine. He funded Stanford University medical research facilities, built hospitals across China, supported earthquake and tsunami relief throughout Asia. There is a direct line between the boy who sold his father's clothes for food and the man who gave billions to help others. Li never forgot what it felt like to be hungry, uneducated, and invisible. He could not go back and give his 15-year-old self a scholarship, but he could give that scholarship to millions standing where he once stood. He once said education was the most important gift, because it is the one thing no one can ever take away. That statement carries extraordinary weight from a man whose own education was taken at age 15. Li did not become a philanthropist after getting rich. He became one because getting rich was never the point. Building something that outlasts him was. But even as he gave billions away, his business instincts never dulled. Because starting in 2013, Li made moves that confused the business world and angered the Chinese government. He began moving his money out of China. Starting in 2013, Li Ka-shing did something that confused the business world. He started moving his money out of China, selling major property holdings in mainland China, reducing exposure to Hong Kong's increasingly uncertain political environment, investing heavily in the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and other Western markets, utilities, infrastructure, telecommunications. Chinese state media was furious. They called him unpatriotic, accused him of abandoning the country that had enriched him. But Li was not making an emotional decision. He was making a strategic one. He had built his fortune by reading the future before anyone else, buying Hong Kong real estate when others fled after the 1967 riots, acquiring Hutchison before anyone imagined a Chinese businessman could own a colonial empire. Now in his mid-80s, he was reading the future again, and what he saw in China and Hong Kong made him move. Not panic, not flee. Move, strategically, methodically, with the same calculated timing that defined every major decision of his career. Think of a farmer who quietly starts buying land in another region. The neighbors are offended, the government is suspicious, but the farmer has noticed the soil changing, the weather shifting. He is not abandoning his land. He is protecting his harvest. Then came 2019, massive political protests in Hong Kong, the national security law, a fundamental shift in the city's freedom. Li's reduced exposure meant his empire weathered these storms far better than competitors. Once again, he had seen the storm before it arrived. Even a planned $22.8 billion port sale collapsed after Beijing opposed it. Proof that even in retirement, his decisions still touched the highest levels of power. But by 2018, Li made one final decision. Not about buying or selling, about letting go. In 2018, at the age of 90, Li Ka-shing made his final business decision. He retired after 75 years of building. From a plastics factory to a global conglomerate, he handed control to his elder son, Victor Li Ka-shing. This was not a surrender, it was a graduation. The 2015 corporate reorganization had prepared everything. Chung Kong and Hutchison Whampoa merged into CK Hutchison Holdings, a streamlined structure designed for smooth family succession. Think about spending your entire life building a house, brick by brick, room by room, year after year. Then one day you hand the keys to your child. The foundation you laid holds firm. The decisions about what happens next belong to someone else. That is what Li did in 2018. And here is what proves the foundation was strong. Since retiring, his wealth has not declined. It has grown from $39 billion in 2024 to $45.1 billion in February 2026. Over $6 billion added in a single year. At 97 years old, fully retired, still getting richer. Not because he is making deals, because the empire he built generates wealth on its own momentum. $16.4 million per day. For a man who once earned $2 per week making plastic watch bands. The distance between those two numbers is almost impossible to comprehend. Yet both exist on the same continuous line of one man's journey. The empire is now in the next generation's hands. And as we close this story, one final truth emerges. As of February 2026, Li Ka-shing is 97 years old, net worth of $45.1 billion, the richest person in Hong Kong, the 38th richest person in the world, one of the most successful self-made businessmen in human history. His empire generates $57.3 billion in annual revenue, employs over 300,000 people, operates in more than 50 countries. His foundation has donated over $2.5 billion. University faculties bear his name. Research hospitals bear his name. But his legacy is not measured in billions. It is measured in what he represents. The idea that where you start does not determine where you finish. That a boy who sells his father's clothes for food can build an empire spanning 50 countries. That education denied can become education given to millions. That a city built by colonial powers can be owned by the people who were once invisible within it. Li did not just succeed, he proved a possibility, and in proving it, he gave hope to everyone in Asia who ever started with nothing. Think about the city you live in. Now imagine one person who arrived as a child with nothing, and over 80 years, built so much of the city's infrastructure that you interact with their companies almost every day without knowing it. That person is real. He is 97 years old. The deepest irony of his story, Hong Kong in 1940 offered him nothing. No safety net, no free education, no help. The city that would later call him Superman once saw him as just another hungry, anonymous boy. Li did not succeed because Hong Kong helped him. He succeeded despite its indifference. And then he turned around and built the hospitals and universities so the next generation would never face what he faced. A refugee who arrived with nothing. A factory worker earning $2 a week, a plastic flower king who became a property titan, a Chinese businessman who conquered a colonial empire, a global tycoon who gave billions away, and at 97, still the richest person in the city he once entered as a penniless child. Li Ka-shing arrived in 1940 as a 12-year-old refugee with nothing, lost his father at 15, sold his father's clothes for food, worked 16-hour days for $2 a week, taught himself business from product catalogs, built a plastic flower empire by age 30, pivoted to real estate and bought during every crash, conquered a British colonial trading house at 51, expanded across 52 countries, built a $57.3 billion revenue empire, gave $2.5 billion to education and healthcare, read the future and moved his money west before the storms arrived, retired at 90 and his wealth kept growing. At 97, still the richest person in Hong Kong, the city he entered as a penniless boy who no one expected to survive. But here is what makes this story more than business. He did not just build wealth in Hong Kong, he built alongside it. When the city was a colonial backwater, he was a factory worker. When it transformed, he pivoted to real estate. When it matured, he acquired its colonial institutions. When its future became uncertain, he diversified globally. Li Ka-shing and Hong Kong grew together. The story of one cannot be told without the other. He owned the city not because he took from it, but because he built with it. Brick by brick, decade by decade, crisis by crisis, until the city and the man became inseparable. A 12-year-old refugee, a plastics factory, $2 a week, and 83 years of building until the boy who had nothing owned the skyline he once stared at from the factory floor. Li Ka-shing did not just build a fortune, he built proof that poverty is not destiny, that a mind determined to learn can turn the most hopeless beginning into the most extraordinary ending. If this story changed how you think about what is possible, hit subscribe. Now tell me in the comments, Which moment hit you hardest? The plastic flowers, the Hutchison acquisition, the move west before the storm, or a 15-year-old boy teaching himself business from factory catalogs while working 16-hour shifts?